Shalom and welcome back to our fifth and final lesson in our class, Study of the Antichrist. In this lesson, we're going to look at some questions that people have raised regarding the Antichrist and his origin. Ethnically, religiously, is the Antichrist going to be a Muslim? Let's look at some of those things. First, we're going to look at the Islamic view of the Antichrist, according to Islamic eschatology. Some of this may be in the Quran, some of it may be in the Hadith, which is an Islamic commentary on the Quran, but these various views are embedded in their eschatology, their study of end times and last things. According to Islamic eschatology, the Antichrist will be a Jew born in Iran. A lot of this is specific. It's kind of interesting. Born to parents childless for 30 years. He has only one eye. They have this description of whom the Antichrist will be. They don't call him the Antichrist, though. We'll talk about that in a second. He claims to be a prophet. Okay, and so this is the Muslim view of the bad character, the evil character that is kind of parallel to our idea of Antichrist, but it's entirely a different thing. Claims to be a prophet, claims to be divine, seeks to be worshipped. He deceives many people by seemingly miraculous acts. This is the Islamic view of the Antichrist, okay? He conquers the world except for Mecca and Medina with a large army. He reigns for 40 days, each day being like a year, and he is called the Dajjal. And so in the Islamic view, they don't use the terminology Antichrist, okay? That's a Bible term. They use the term Dajjal, the Islamic evil character in the end times. Now, they also have a view of the Islamic Messiah, okay? The Antichrist is called the Dajjal. The Islamic Messiah, okay, the good character in Islamic eschatology, is called the Mahdi. He's a descendant of Muhammad. He rides on a white horse. He brings global deliverance from the reign of the Dajjal. He conquers and slaughters the Jews. Interesting. He establishes his headquarters in Jerusalem. He reigns for at least 7 years. Now, with that being said, we've looked at the Islamic view of the Antichrist, the Dajjal, and also the Islamic view of the Messiah, the Mahdi. Now let's look at the Islamic view of Jesus. Now, there is a person in the Quran mentioned a couple dozen times, and his name is Isa. This is not the Jesus of the Bible. This is their version of Jesus. It's another Jesus. It's not the Jesus of the Bible. But in their view, Isa, Jesus, was one of the foremost prophets of Allah. He was a lesser prophet than Muhammad. He was a sinless man who was a messenger of God. He was not the Son of God or God in human flesh. He was not crucified or resurrected, but was raised directly into heaven by Allah. He was not a sacrifice to atone for the sins of mankind. According to the Islamic view of the end times, Isa will come back to earth to the Mount of Olives, meet up with the Mahdi. The Mahdi is the Islamic Messiah, okay, and submit himself to him. So the Islamic Jesus, the Isa of the Quran, he is going to submit himself to the Islamic Messiah, the Mahdi. He's going to slay all of those who do not accept Islam as the one true religion. He's going to kill the Dajjal, the Islamic Antichrist. and C, to the annihilation of the Jews. This is so contrary to what the Bible teaches, but it is the Islamic view of this man that they claim is Jesus, but he's an entirely different person. He will reign, Isa of Islam, he will reign for 40 years after the death of the Mahdi. Now, who's the Mahdi? The Mahdi is the Islamic Messiah. Okay? Get those terms kind of straight in your mind. The Dajjal is the Islamic Antichrist. The Mahdi is the Islamic Messiah. He will reign for 40 years, speaking of Isa, okay, their version of Jesus. He will reign for 40 years after the death of the Mahdi, assume control of the Islamic global kingdom, bring global blessing, bring peace on earth, and he will marry and have children. This is an entirely different narrative, an entirely different person than the biblical Jesus. According to Islam, he will die and be buried next to Muhammad in Medina. He will then be resurrected with all other men and women on the last day. Now, with those three being studied and under our belt, okay, we have the Mahdi, the Dajjal, and the Islamic Jesus known as Isa. Does that then mean that the Antichrist, the biblical Antichrist, may be a Muslim? These are some things that the proponents of this view would say, okay, the arguments in favor of a Muslim Antichrist. They would say that the Islamic Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah, okay, the one that's viewed favorably in Islam, will actually be the Antichrist described in the Bible. Is this plausible? They would also say that the Muslim Jesus, Isa, will be the false prophet spoken of in the Bible, who will render service to the Antichrist, the Mahdi. Now, does this kind of seem like it could actually happen? Now remember, the Mahdi is the Islamic Messiah. So what this view is saying, the one that the Muslims that they view favorably, the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah, would in actuality be the biblical Antichrist, whom Isa submits himself to. They also say that both these individuals will be destroyed when the true biblical Jesus at the end of the tribulation period returns. Now, we've looked at that in Revelation chapter 19. So what are the arguments against the Antichrist being a Muslim? Well, we have to keep in mind the fact that Islamic eschatology does not line up with what the Bible teaches. Even if we are to think that the Islamic Messiah, the Mahdi, would fit into the role of the biblical Antichrist, there are still many contradictions that are there. Okay? Also, in order to do this, in order to make it so that the Antichrist would be a Muslim, we become dependent upon Islamic eschatology, upon what the Quran teaches and the various Islamic commentaries on the Quran. There's also, within all of that, Muslim disagreements on the Islamic Messiah, the Mahdi. We've already looked at the Antichrist will be of Roman descent, most likely, arising out of a revived Roman Empire, and the fact that the people of the prince that shall come were Roman, the Roman armies that destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, are spoken of as being the people of the Antichrist. Were they Muslim? Islam did not exist at that point in time and would not come into existence for another hundreds of years. Also, the Antichrist makes a covenant with Israel. Are we to think that Israel would accept a peace treaty that is brought about by one who is their enemy. This is something that kind of is problematic in thinking that the Antichrist would be Muslim. Also, the Antichrist, he claims to be God. Within the Islamic view, and I've spoken to a number of Muslims about this, when I speak to them about Jesus being God, that's very offensive to them because they very strongly hold to the idea that Allah only is God and that God cannot become man. And so the view that they have contradicts and does not mesh with what we know the Antichrist to be and to do. He does not worship Allah, he worships himself. And he himself claims to be God. We don't see this mesh with the Islamic theology or Islamic eschatology as we look at the end times. It doesn't line up. Also, the Antichrist's domain is worldwide. And so when we see different things explained in the Quran about what the Antichrist will do and what he will attempt to do, and the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah, and the actions that he takes, it doesn't line up with what we see in the scripture. When we think about the Ezekiel invasion, in those various armies, if you remember back to, I think it was our first lesson, talked about some things that happen in the timeline of the tribulation period with the Antichrist and the various armies that invade, and Gog and Magog, and Turkey and Russia and Iran and others. These nations, many of them, are by far and away majority Islamic nations. How then and why then would the Antichrist attack or fight off or defeat or go to war with these nations which are comprised, the majority, as Islamic nations? It just does not make sense. It does not work well together. So when we look at all of these things regarding the Antichrist, we've seen things that will happen in the course of events during the tribulation period. We've seen the names that the Antichrist is given in the scripture. We've seen his character, some things that characterize him as who he is, what drives him, and what he does, and then his ultimate demise. Looking at all of these things also with the idea in view that the Antichrist, I don't believe, biblically, would be of Islamic origin or Muslim descent. What we see in the scripture is a man that arises out of the revived Roman Empire with no connections to Islam or Muslim eschatology. And so I hope that this class has been a blessing to you. We've looked at a lot of different scriptures multiple times, and so hopefully maybe some of these scriptures that were not as familiar to you are definitely familiar now. And hopefully you've gotten a better understanding and a more rounded view of who the Antichrist is, what he will do, and how he meets his ultimate demise. Thank you for joining us in this class. God bless you, and shalom.